a first-class flight, a simple seat assignment, and a decision that would change everything. When Richard Andrews, a wealthy businessman, demands that a black woman be removed from her seat, he expects instant compliance. But what starts as an act of arrogance quickly spirals into a reckoning he never saw coming. The woman he tried to dismiss? She's not just any passenger. And the people he once ignored? They're about to make sure he listens. As Richard's world unravels, his career, his reputation, and his power, he faces a choice: fight to regain control, or confront the truth about himself. But is real change possible? Or is redemption just another performance? Stay with us as we follow this gripping journey of downfall, accountability, and the long road to redemption. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. The first-class cabin of Flight 762 was a quiet sanctuary of luxury. Plush leather seats, soft overhead lighting, and the subtle clinking of champagne glasses created an air of exclusivity. Lisa Carter adjusted the cuffs of her tailored navy blazer and crossed her legs elegantly. Her deep brown skin contrasted beautifully with the cream-colored seat. She reached for the in-flight magazine, her gold bracelet catching the light. Just as she flipped through the pages, a man dropped into the seat beside her with an audible grunt. Richard Andrews, a middle-aged businessman with salt and pepper hair, exhaled sharply as he settled in. He adjusted his expensive Rolex, straightened his suit jacket, and glanced around the cabin with a sense of entitlement. Then his gaze landed on Lisa. His expression soured instantly. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He shifted uncomfortably, as if the very air had become unbreathable. Richard jabbed at the service button above him. A few moments later, a flight attendant named Emily appeared, her smile polite and professional. "Good evening, sir. How can I assist you?" Richard barely acknowledged her presence. His gaze remained fixed ahead as he spoke. "I want a different seat," he said coldly. Emily blinked. "Is there a problem with your seat, sir?" Richard sighed, clearly irritated. "Yes. I don't want to sit next to her." He motioned toward Lisa without looking at her, as though she were an object rather than a person. The air around them shifted. A few passengers glanced up from their seats. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lisa, however, remained unfazed. She calmly reached into her blazer pocket, retrieved her phone, and tapped a quick message before slipping it back inside. Emily's smile faltered. She straightened her posture. "I'm sorry, sir. We do not accommodate seat changes based on personal preferences like that." Richard scoffed. "I paid for a first-class ticket. I should be able to choose who I sit next to." Emily didn't budge. "Our policy is clear, sir. Unless there's a legitimate issue with your seat." "The issue," Richard interrupted, his voice rising, "is that I do not want to sit next to her." The cabin fell silent. Lisa turned a page in her magazine, completely unbothered. A male flight attendant named Mark approached, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Richard turned to him, exasperated. "Yes. I'm being forced to sit next to this woman, and I'd like a different seat." Mark exchanged a glance with Emily before replying. "Sir, all first-class seats are occupied. However, if any upgrades become available, we will let you know." Lisa, still composed, finally spoke, her voice smooth and controlled. "If Mr. Andrews is that uncomfortable, I don't mind moving," she said. Emily hesitated, then checked the tablet in her hand. After a few taps, her eyes flickered with something unreadable before she smiled. "Actually, Miss Carter, there is an available seat," she said. "One of our exclusive first-class suites just opened up. Would you like to move there?" A murmur spread through the cabin. Lisa gave a polite nod. "That sounds lovely." Richard grinned smugly, assuming he had won. But then Mark turned back to him. "Unfortunately, sir, we cannot accommodate your request. You will remain in your current seat." The color drained from Richard's face. "Excuse me? You're upgrading her?" Emily's polite smile didn't waver. Yes, sir. Miss Carter is now moving to one of our premium suites. Lisa stood gracefully, gathering her belongings. Before stepping away, she turned and met Richard's furious gaze. I hope you enjoy your seat, Mr. Andrews, she said smoothly. Then, with effortless elegance, she walked away. Richard clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Richard Andrews sat rigid in his seat, his face flushed with barely contained rage. The quiet murmurs of nearby passengers only fueled his humiliation. He wasn't used to being denied anything, let alone being dismissed like some unruly child. Lisa Carter, meanwhile, had disappeared behind the sleek partition leading to the luxury first-class suite, an area reserved for VIP guests, far more exclusive than his seat. Richard gritted his teeth. How did that woman deserve an upgrade over him? This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was an insult. He inhaled sharply, trying to compose himself. He had connections, powerful ones. If these flight attendants thought they could embarrass him, they were mistaken. He'd make a few calls once they landed. Someone would pay for this. But first he needed to know who she was. Richard turned to the man sitting across the aisle, an older gentleman in a gray suit who had been silently observing the exchange. Can you believe this nonsense? Richard muttered, forcing a laugh. I ask for a simple seat change, and they reward her with an upgrade. The older man raised an eyebrow. You really don't know who she is, do you? Richard frowned. She's just some entitled, the man chuckled, shaking his head. Lisa Carter isn't just anyone, Mr. Andrews. She's one of the most powerful women in the aviation industry. Richard stiffened. What? Lisa Carter is an international aviation inspector, the man continued. She oversees airline policies, passenger treatment, and discrimination cases. And if I were you, I'd start praying she doesn't file a report about this little outburst of yours. A sinking feeling clawed at Richard's stomach. That's not possible, he scoffed, though his voice wavered. She was just sitting there, like a regular passenger. She's known for traveling discreetly, the man said. She doesn't announce herself unless necessary. But given what just happened, I'd say you made it necessary. Richard swallowed hard. He had assumed Lisa was just another passenger, but now this changed everything. Before he could fully process the implications, Mark, the male flight attendant, returned. Mr. Andrews, he said smoothly, our captain has been informed about the situation. He would like to speak with you personally. Richard frowned. The captain? Yes, sir, Mark said. Right this way. Passengers watched as Richard reluctantly stood, adjusting his tie as if that would restore his authority. He followed Mark toward the cockpit, his mind racing. Maybe the captain would see reason. Maybe he could still turn this situation around. But when the cockpit door opened, Richard stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting inside was not just the captain, but another man in an impeccably tailored suit, his presence radiating quiet authority. Lisa Carter's husband. Richard didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Jonathan Carter, the United States Secretary of Transportation, the man who oversaw not only commercial airlines, but the entire aviation industry. Sweat beaded at Richard's temple. This was no longer just a minor confrontation. This was career suicide. Jonathan Carter regarded him coolly, tapping a pen against the armrest of his seat. Mr. Andrews, he said in a measured tone, I hear you've had some issues with your seatmate. Richard struggled to find words. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant. Jonathan held up a hand. Stop, he said. Richard's mouth snapped shut. Jonathan exhaled, then leaned forward slightly. My wife and I fly frequently, he said. And in all my years in the industry, I've seen many incidents of passengers mistreating airline staff. But rarely do I see someone display such open hostility toward another traveler for no reason other than the color of their skin. It wasn't about that, Richard stammered. I wasn't comfortable. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Uncomfortable? His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was suffocating. Tell me, Mr. Andrews, do you often demand seat changes when sitting next to women? Or was it something else that made you uncomfortable? Richard's face burned. He had no way out. Sir, let me be clear, Jonathan interrupted. You didn't just insult my wife. You didn't just embarrass yourself. You demonstrated to an entire flight crew and dozens of passengers exactly the kind of man you are. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. This airline operates under strict anti-discrimination policies, Jonathan continued. Policies that my wife has helped shape. That means you're not just dealing with a complaint, you're looking at an official report, one that could ban you from multiple airlines. Richard's knees felt weak. Ban me? He echoed. Jonathan exchanged a glance with the captain, who gave a slight nod. You have two choices, Jonathan said. You can remain on this flight and accept the consequences once we land, because trust me, this incident will be reported. He let the words sink in before adding, or you can take the other option. Richard licked his lips. And what's that? Jonathan nodded toward Mark, who stepped forward, holding something in his hand. A new boarding pass. A different boarding pass. Richard took it hesitantly and turned it over. His stomach dropped. Sir, Mark said, barely suppressing a smirk, this is your ticket for the next available flight. Wait, what? Richard's voice shot up an octave. You're kicking me off this plane? Not at all, Jonathan said smoothly. We're simply offering you an alternative one that lets you reconsider your actions while you wait for the next flight 12 hours from now. Richard's mouth opened and closed. He turned to the captain for support, but the man simply folded his arms. You have 5 minutes to gather your things, Mark added. The walls of the cockpit seemed to close in. Richard could feel the weight of every mistake he had made. There was no fight left in him. Defeated, humiliated, and exposed, he turned and stumbled back toward his seat to collect his belongings. As he did, every passenger who had witnessed the ordeal watched in silence. Some whispered, others smirked, and in the first-class suite, sipping a glass of champagne, Lisa Carter watched it all unfold with quiet amusement. Richard Andrews had never felt smaller. He shuffled back toward his seat, his mind spinning as he gripped the freshly issued boarding pass in his sweaty palm. It was real. They were actually removing him from the flight. Passengers were watching. Some whispered. Others didn't even bother to hide their smirks. The humiliation was suffocating. The flight attendant, Mark, walked closely behind him, maintaining a professional but firm presence. There was no room for negotiation. He had lost. Richard reached his seat and grabbed his carry-on with stiff movements. He wanted to protest, to argue that this was unfair. But deep down he knew there was no point. His own arrogance had led him here. As Richard turned toward the exit, his eyes flicked toward the first-class suite where Lisa Carter sat, sipping champagne. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smirking. She simply met his gaze with a look of quiet finality, as if this moment had played out exactly as she had expected it to. For the first time, Richard felt something he wasn't used to. Shame. He didn't want to admit it, but the power had completely shifted. Lisa Carter had controlled this situation from the start. And now, she was watching him leave. The moment stretched as Lisa set her glass down. Then, in a voice just loud enough for him to hear, she spoke. I hope the wait isn't too long, Mr. Andrews. A perfectly polite farewell, yet dripping with an unspoken message. Richard clenched his jaw and hurried toward the exit, his pulse hammering against his temples. The flight attendants escorted him through the jet bridge, where airport security was already waiting. A uniformed officer, an older man with a tired expression, sighed as he glanced at the paperwork in his hands. Mr. Andrews, it looks like you'll be waiting for the next flight out. Richard barely acknowledged him. He was still processing the fact that this was real. You can wait in the main terminal, the officer continued. Unfortunately, due to the circumstances, your access to the first-class lounge has been revoked. Richard snapped his head up. Revoked? That's correct, the officer said, his tone matter-of-fact. Your ticket downgrade means you're no longer eligible for priority services. Richard inhaled sharply, his last shred of dignity slipping away. He had expected a delay, but now he realized he was about to experience true inconvenience. He spent the next hour standing in line at the customer service desk, surrounded by exhausted travelers. Gone were the luxury perks he had once taken for granted: the priority boarding, the complimentary drinks, the effortless comfort. Instead, he sat in the crowded general waiting area, wedged between a crying toddler and a man loudly talking on the phone. His privilege had been stripped away, and for the first time, he was seeing the world from a very different perspective. At hour 6 of his wait, Richard heard a familiar voice behind him. I almost didn't recognize you without the arrogance. His stomach dropped. He turned and saw Peter Thompson, the vice president of human resources at the company Richard worked for. Peter took the empty seat beside him, crossing his legs. Imagine my surprise when I got a message about one of our senior executives being removed from a flight for discriminatory behavior. Richard's mouth went dry. Peter, I can explain. You don't need to, Peter interrupted. I saw the video. Richard paled. What video? Peter pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. To Richard's horror, there it was. A viral clip captured by a passenger showing him demanding Lisa Carter be moved. The caption read, Man tries to get black woman removed from first class. Guess who gets kicked off instead? The view count? Over 2 million and climbing. Richard slumped back in his chair, his career flashing before his eyes. Peter exhaled, shaking his head. Richard, our company has a strict policy against discrimination. This kind of attention is, let's just say, not ideal for someone in your position. I didn't know who she was, Richard blurted out, desperate. Peter chuckled, but there was no humor in it. And if she wasn't someone important, would your behavior have been acceptable? Richard had no answer. Peter stood, brushing off his jacket. The board will be reviewing your conduct. I suggest you prepare for the worst. Richard swallowed hard. You're firing me? Peter gave him a long, pointed look. You'll hear from us soon. Then he walked away, leaving Richard in absolute silence. For the first time, Richard Andrews realized something. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about who he had chosen to be. And now, he was paying the price. Richard Andrews sat frozen in the airport terminal, the harsh glow of the overhead lights making his headache worse. His phone screen reflected his pale, stricken face as he stared at the viral video still playing on loop. Each humiliating second unfolded with gut-wrenching clarity. His own voice, dripping with entitlement. The looks of quiet judgment from the flight attendants. And worst of all, Lisa Carter's calm, effortless control over the situation. The internet had already done its work. Trending hashtags. Racist passenger karma, first class justice, wrong woman to mess with the comment section was brutal. This is what happens when you think money makes you better than others. Love to see it. She didn't even have to argue. The universe just humbled him for her. This guy better stay offline for a few years. Richard gritted his teeth and shut off his phone. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. It was a complete and total collapse of his public image. His fingers clenched around the armrest. How had this happened so fast? Just as Richard tried to collect himself, his phone vibrated. Incoming call. Catherine Andrews, his wife. His throat went dry. Of course she had seen it. He considered ignoring it, but he knew that would only make things worse. Taking a deep breath, he answered. Richard, Catherine's voice was cold. Tell me this video isn't real. He closed his eyes. Catherine, it's not what it looks like. A bitter laugh. Not what it looks like. Richard, I just got a call from my board members asking if I was aware that my husband was making headlines as a racist in first class. Catherine was a senior executive at a Fortune 500 company. Her public image was pristine, carefully curated over years of work. This scandal wasn't just his, it was bleeding into her career too. "You're overreacting," Richard muttered, though even he didn't believe it. Catherine inhaled sharply. "Richard, do you have any idea what you've done? Our daughter's school called me. Parents are talking. My reputation is being dragged down because of you." Richard swallowed hard. His entire world was crumbling piece by piece. "Catherine," he tried again, I can fix this." A pause. Then, the final blow. "I don't think you can," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I need to think about our future, Richard. And right now I don't know if you're part of it." Click. The call ended. Richard stared at his phone, feeling the weight of what he had just lost. Lisa Carter had just landed. She sat in the back seat of a luxury car, scrolling through the news articles, flooding her feed. The story had blown up even more than she expected. Her inbox was full reporters requesting interviews, activists thanking her, executives reaching out with apologies on behalf of the airline industry. She sighed, setting her phone aside. She hadn't wanted any of this. Her goal had never been to make Richard Andrews famous. But karma had a way of working itself out. Just then, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Jonathan Carter. Her husband. She answered, smiling slightly. "Hey, love. How was your flight?" Jonathan chuckled. "Less eventful than yours, apparently." Lisa shook her head. "I wasn't trying to go viral. I just wanted to enjoy my flight in peace." "Well," Jonathan said, "it looks like the world had other plans." Lisa rubbed her temple. "The airline already reached out, offering a formal apology. They want to issue a public statement condemning his behavior." "As they should," Jonathan said. "But the bigger question is, what do you want to do?" Lisa exhaled. That was the real question, wasn't it? The internet wanted blood. They wanted Richard Andrews fired, blacklisted, and permanently disgraced. But Lisa had never been about revenge. She was about change. "I don't want to destroy the man," she said slowly. "I want him to understand why what he did was wrong. Public humiliation fades, but real change? That sticks." Jonathan hummed in agreement. "So what's the plan?" Lisa thought for a moment. Then, a small smile formed on her lips. "He wants his power back," she said. "Let's see if he's willing to earn it the right way." Richard Andrews sat hunched in an uncomfortable plastic chair at the airport terminal, exhaustion weighing him down. His tailored suit, once pristine, now felt stifling. The smell of fast food and the constant buzz of airport announcements only added to his misery. For the past 12 hours, he had been forced to sit among the very people he once looked down upon, ordinary travelers, crammed into crowded seats, waiting endlessly for their flights. Every few minutes, someone would glance at him, recognizing his face from the viral video. Whispers. Stifled laughter. A few people even took photos of him, pretending to take selfies, but clearly capturing his downfall. He hated it. But even more than the humiliation, he hated the realization gnawing at him. He had done this to himself. His phone vibrated in his hand. He expected another scathing message from his wife, Catherine. Instead, the name on the screen sent a fresh wave of panic through him. Lisa Carter. For a brief second, he considered ignoring it. But something told him that would be a mistake. With a shaky breath, he answered. "Hello?" Lisa's voice came through calm, steady, and unreadable. "Mr. Andrews, I assume you've had time to reflect." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Of course she was enjoying this. He exhaled slowly. "Look, Ms. Carter, I'm not calling to hear your excuses," she interrupted. "I'm calling to give you a choice." Richard's pulse quickened. A choice? What kind of choice could she possibly be offering? "I have no interest in ruining your life, Mr. Andrews," Lisa continued. "Despite what the internet might think, I'm not out for revenge. But you need to understand your actions have consequences." Richard swallowed hard. "I already lost my job. My wife," his voice caught. He didn't want to admit the truth, but he knew Catherine was seriously considering leaving him. "I'm aware," Lisa said, "but losing everything doesn't mean learning anything. And that's why I'm offering you an alternative." Richard frowned. "Alternative? You want your life back?" Lisa asked. "You want to salvage your career, your reputation?" Richard clenched his jaw. "Of course I do." "Then prove it," Lisa said simply. Silence stretched between them. Lisa let the pause linger before finally continuing. "I've spoken with the airline," she said. "They're offering a deal. Instead of blacklisting you, they're willing to let you participate in a public diversity and inclusion initiative." Richard blinked. "What?" "You would be required to attend workshops, make a public statement of accountability, and contribute to a program that educates businesses on bias and discrimination." Richard scoffed. "So, what? I'm supposed to sit in a classroom and be lectured about wokeness?" Lisa didn't react to his tone. "Or, of course, you can refuse, and your name will continue to be synonymous with racial discrimination. Your former company will release a statement distancing itself from you. Your reputation will remain permanently damaged, and you'll never work in corporate leadership again." Richard's heart pounded. She was offering him a lifeline, a way out. But at what cost? He could feel every instinct inside him resisting. He had spent years building his career, believing in a world where he was in control. And now, a black woman he had dismissed as beneath him was the one holding all the power. It made him sick. But the alternative? Complete and utter destruction. His thoughts flashed to his wife's furious voice, his daughter's disappointment, his career crumbling in real time. Finally, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "What do I have to do?" Lisa's tone remained even, almost bored. "You'll receive the full details soon. But it starts with an apology." Richard exhaled sharply. "A public apology?" "Yes," Lisa said. "A real one. Not one of those, 'I'm sorry if anyone was offended' non-apologies. You'll admit your actions. You'll acknowledge why they were wrong. And you'll mean it." Richard hated this. Every fiber of his being rebelled at the thought of standing in front of cameras, admitting fault. But he hated the alternative even more. "Fine," he said, voice tight. "I'll do it." Lisa didn't react with triumph. If anything, she sounded like she had expected this outcome all along. "I'll be watching, Mr. Andrews," she said. "Let's see if you can change, or if you'll just go through the motions and hope people forget." The call ended. Richard sat motionless, the airport noise fading into the background. For the first time, he wasn't in control, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Richard Andrews had delivered countless speeches in his career. As a senior executive, he was used to commanding rooms, closing deals, and shaping corporate narratives with carefully chosen words. But this was different. This wasn't a power move. This was damage control. And every word had to be perfect. The air inside the conference room was thick with tension. The podium, adorned with a generic corporate backdrop, stood at the front of the room, flanked by microphones from every major news outlet. Richard sat in a side room, staring at himself in the mirror. His face looked hollow, his usually impeccable suit feeling more like a noose than a source of confidence. Outside, reporters whispered among themselves, waiting for the moment of reckoning. His publicist stood beside him, flipping through printed copies of his speech. "We need sincerity, Richard," she said firmly. "If people sense even a hint of insincerity, this will only make things worse." Richard exhaled. That was the problem, wasn't it? He didn't feel sincere. He felt cornered. Lisa Carter had forced his hand, and now the world was watching. A staffer poked their head in. "It's time." Richard emerged from the back room, the sound of flashing cameras nearly deafening. As he stepped up to the podium, rows of reporters, cameras, and live-streaming devices aimed directly at him. The world was waiting. He gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white, then cleared his throat. "Good afternoon." His voice sounded unnatural, even to himself. I want to take this moment to address an incident that occurred on Flight 762. Murmurs spread through the room. My behavior on that flight was unacceptable. I acted with entitlement, arrogance, and disregard for the dignity of another passenger. More importantly, my actions reflected a mindset that has no place in today's world. For that, I am deeply sorry. Click, click, click. The cameras never stopped flashing. Miss Carter did not deserve the way I treated her. No one does. My actions were not only disrespectful, but they reinforced harmful biases that people of color experience every day. I am ashamed of how I acted, and I take full responsibility. Silence. The press expected excuses. They expected deflection. But Richard had given them neither. He paused deliberately before continuing. I understand that words alone are not enough. That is why I have agreed to take part in a corporate diversity and inclusion initiative, working with industry leaders to educate myself and others on implicit bias, privilege, and accountability. I do not expect forgiveness, but I do hope to prove that I am capable of change. Another pause. Then he forced himself to look directly into the cameras. I am sorry, and I will do better. Then he stepped back. The room remained silent. For 3 long seconds, there was no applause, no immediate questions, just the weight of his words hanging in the air. In her office, Lisa Carter sat with her arms crossed, watching the live stream on her laptop. She had heard 1,000 apologies like this before. Some were genuine. Most were scripted performances. But there was something different about this one. Richard's ego was still there, but it was dented, bruised, struggling against the reality that he had been broken down in front of the world. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Was he actually learning something? Or was he just desperate to rebuild himself? Time would tell. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jonathan. That was a better apology than I expected. Lisa smirked. We'll see if he actually means it. Within an hour, the internet exploded. Was Richard Andrews' apology genuine, or just another PR stunt? Lisa Carter reacts to Andrews' apology. Her response is ice cold. Can a racist truly change? Experts weigh in. Some people accepted the apology as a first step. Others called for his permanent cancellation. One thing was certain. Richard's life would never be the same. But for the first time, even Richard wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Richard Andrews had expected the apology to be the hardest part. He had convinced himself that once he stood in front of the cameras, admitted his mistakes, and promised to do better, the world would move on. But the world didn't forget so easily. In the days following the press conference, Richard became the center of a global debate. Some praised him for taking responsibility. At least he owned up to it. That's more than most people in his position would do. Others weren't buying it. If he wasn't caught, would he have ever apologized? No. This is about saving his own skin. Then there were those who wanted real action before considering forgiveness. Apologies are cheap. Let's see what he actually does. For Richard, there was no escaping the weight of public scrutiny. Every article, every talk show discussion, every comment thread, he had become a case study in corporate downfall. A week after the press conference, Richard received an email with a subject line that made his stomach tighten. Invitation. One-on-one with Lisa Carter. His first instinct was to decline. He had already been humiliated once. Why would he willingly put himself in front of Lisa Carter again? But deep down, he knew this was inevitable. If he wanted any chance at rebuilding his reputation, he had to face the woman who had become the symbol of his downfall. And so, he accepted. The meeting was held in a sleek, modern conference room inside Carter Foundation headquarters, Lisa's organization dedicated to equity and justice in corporate spaces. Richard arrived early, dressed in a subdued gray suit. No flashy accessories. No power stance. For the first time in years, he felt small. When Lisa entered, She was as poised as ever, calm, confident, completely in control. "Mr. Andrews," she greeted, taking a seat across from him. He swallowed. "Ms. Carter." She leaned back, studying him. "I assume you know why I asked you here." Richard exhaled. "I imagine it's not just to make sure my apology wasn't scripted." Lisa tilted her head. "Not entirely. But let's start there. Did you mean it?" He hesitated. The truth was complicated. Did he regret what happened? Yes. Did he hate the way his life had unraveled? Absolutely. But had he truly changed? "I'm trying to," he admitted finally. Lisa nodded, as if she expected that answer. "Trying isn't enough, Mr. Andrews. The world is full of people who try but never actually change." Richard felt his frustration bubble up. "What do you want from me? I lost my job. My wife barely speaks to me. I've been ridiculed on every media platform. Haven't I paid enough?" Lisa didn't flinch. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about whether you actually learn from this, or just wait for the world to forget." Richard clenched his jaw. He wanted to snap back, to argue, to remind her that he had already suffered enough. But something stopped him. She was right. If all he did was wait for the outrage to die down, then nothing had changed at all. For the first time, Richard saw the real choice in front of him. He could spend the rest of his life fighting against the consequences of his own actions. Or he could do something meaningful with them. Lisa watched him carefully. "The airline's diversity initiative starts next month. You'll be working with people who actually understand the struggles you dismissed." Richard exhaled, feeling the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. "Then I'll see you next month," he said. Lisa gave a small nod. "We'll see." And with that, the meeting was over. As Richard left the Carter Foundation building, he realized something. For the first time since the incident, no one was forcing him to do anything. No cameras, no publicists, no board members, just him. And now, he had to decide whether he would truly change, or if this was just another way to survive. Richard Andrews sat in the back of a modest conference room, staring at the laminated packet on the table in front of him. Cultural Competency and Bias Awareness Training, Airline Industry Edition. The title alone made him feel utterly out of place. A month ago, he had been a respected corporate executive, giving presentations to packed auditoriums. Now, he was a disgraced businessman, sitting among a group of employees, flight attendants, and corporate trainees in a mandatory diversity training program. The irony was almost unbearable. But here he was. Lisa Carter had made it clear this was his only path forward. And the worst part? He wasn't in control of anything. A woman in a burgundy blazer stepped to the front of the room, clearing her throat. "Good morning, everyone," she said. "I'm Ava Martinez, and I'll be leading today's session on unconscious bias in the airline industry." She gestured to the screen behind her, which displayed a powerful statistic. "Did you know that black passengers are 80% more likely to be asked to switch seats or prove their ticket validity than white passengers?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ava continued, scanning the room. "We're here today because bias, whether conscious or unconscious, affects the way we interact with others. And sometimes we don't even realize the harm we're causing." Her gaze lingered on Richard for a split second. He felt the weight of it. Everyone in this room knew why he was here. Ava clicked to the next slide. "Let's analyze a real case study," she said, pulling up a still image from a video. Richard's stomach dropped. It was his incident. The freeze frame showed him on the plane, pointing aggressively at Lisa Carter while speaking to the flight attendant. His face burned with humiliation. Ava continued, pretending not to notice his discomfort. "Let's break this down. What do we see happening here?" A young black woman at the table next to him raised her hand. "Well, for one, the man in the video," she hesitated, glancing at Richard before continuing, "assumed that the woman next to him didn't belong in first class." A man across the room nodded. "Yeah, and he was so confident that he had the right to demand she be moved. Like he was the only person who mattered in that cabin. More murmurs of agreement. Richard gritted his teeth. It was surreal, sitting there as people dissected his behavior like a case study. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant for things to escalate, that it wasn't about race, but he knew better than to say it. Because the truth was, his intentions didn't matter. Ava turned to Richard. "Mr. Andrews," she said smoothly, "since you're here to learn, let me ask, what do you see when you look at this image?" Every eye in the room turned to him. For a moment, Richard considered lying. He could spin this, say something polished, something corporate-friendly, that sounded good in headlines. But then he caught Lisa Carter's expression from across the room. She wasn't glaring at him. She wasn't waiting for him to fail. She was just watching. And suddenly, Richard felt exhausted by the idea of pretending. So he exhaled and told the truth. "I see a man who thought he was more important than the person sitting next to him." Silence. Ava folded her arms. "Go on." Richard hesitated, but then the words started coming out. "I see someone who assumed, without thinking, that the woman beside him didn't belong. Someone who," he swallowed, forcing himself to say it, "felt entitled to dictate who should and shouldn't be in first class." He forced himself to meet Lisa's eyes. "And someone who's just now realizing how much damage that mindset causes." Lisa didn't react, but something in her expression shifted. For the first time, Richard wasn't sure if it was pity or respect. The rest of the session wasn't easy. Richard sat through testimonials from Black flight attendants who had been falsely accused of being disruptive. He listened to stories from passengers who had been humiliated for no reason other than existing in spaces people, like him, had claimed as their own. And for the first time, he didn't feel defensive. He felt guilty. By the time the session ended, Ava addressed the room one last time. "Change isn't just about saying the right words," she said. "It's about sitting with discomfort, listening, and making better choices. And it doesn't happen overnight." She locked eyes with Richard. "For some, it's a long road." Richard nodded. He knew she was right. As the participants filed out, Lisa Carter approached him, holding her bag. "That was the first honest thing I've heard you say since this started," she remarked. Richard didn't try to deny it. Instead, he simply asked, "Do you think I can actually change?" Lisa studied him for a moment. Then she shrugged. "That's up to you." And with that, she walked away. For the first time, Richard wasn't angry. He was determined. He wasn't sure where this path led. But for the first time in his life, he was actually willing to find out. Richard Andrews left the training session with a strange heaviness in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. A month ago, he had been a powerful executive, a man who demanded and expected control. Now, he was just another man trying to fix something he wasn't sure could be fixed. As he stepped out of the Carter Foundation building, the afternoon air felt heavy. Lisa Carter's words echoed in his mind. "That's up to you." She hadn't given him praise. She hadn't told him he was on the right path, because she didn't believe in words alone. And maybe, for the first time, neither did he. Richard unlocked his phone and immediately regretted it. The internet hadn't forgotten about him. News outlets were still dissecting his apology. Social media debates still raged on. Richard Andrews is just doing PR. He doesn't actually care. Let's see him actually take action before we forgive him. Where was this self-reflection before he got caught? Richard clenched his jaw and shut off his phone. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but knowing and experiencing it firsthand were two very different things. That evening, Richard received an email from Ava Martinez, the diversity trainer from earlier. Subject: an opportunity to prove yourself, Richard. We're hosting a community panel this Friday, where employees and passengers will share their experiences with discrimination in the airline industry. I'd like you to be there, not as a speaker, as a listener. This is where real change happens. When people like you stop talking and start hearing the voices that were ignored for so long. It's optional. But if you're serious about change, you'll show up. Best, Ava Martinez. Richard exhaled, reading the email twice. A public event. In front of real people. Real stories. He could already imagine the whispers. The stares. The reminder that he was still the villain in this story. A part of him wanted to ignore the email. He had already done the training. Wasn't that enough? But another part of him, the part that had sat through that session and realized how much he had ignored, told him this was exactly what he needed. 2 days later, Richard stepped into a packed conference room. Rows of chairs were filled with airline employees, passengers, and reporters. The atmosphere was tense, but expectant. At the front of the room, a panel of 5 individuals sat in a semicircle. Among them was Lisa Carter. Of course she was here. Richard took a seat in the back, hoping to go unnoticed. It didn't work. Whispers started almost immediately. Some attendees glanced at him, nudging the person next to them. He forced himself to sit still, to endure it. Then, the first panelist began to speak. A middle-aged black flight attendant took the microphone. My name is Diane Harper, and I've been working in the airline industry for 20 years. And in those 20 years, I've had more white passengers question my credentials, my presence, and my authority than I can count. She scanned the audience. I've been accused of stealing when I was just checking a first-class ticket. I've had passengers demand I prove I belong in uniform. And I've had men like Richard Andrews, her eyes flickered toward him, tell me I don't belong in certain spaces. Richard felt every eye in the room turn toward him. Diane continued. And the worst part? Most of the time, it wasn't about yelling or threats. It was about that quiet, dismissive assumption that I wasn't supposed to be there, that someone like me in first class had to be a mistake. A few nods, some murmurs of agreement. Lisa Carter leaned forward, speaking for the first time. Diane, she said, what would you say to someone who insists they didn't mean it that way? Diane let out a humorless laugh. I'd tell them that intent doesn't erase impact. Richard stiffened, because that was exactly what he had tried to tell himself on that plane. I didn't mean it that way. I wasn't trying to be racist. It was just a misunderstanding. But none of that changed the reality of what he had done. Lisa turned toward the audience. Any thoughts? A young man raised his hand. Yeah, my name's Aaron, and I was a passenger on Flight 762. I was in row 4 and I saw everything. Richard's breath caught. Aaron had been there. I watched Mr. Andrews act like he was entitled to that seat more than the woman sitting next to him, Aaron said. I watched him get frustrated when people didn't immediately bow to his demands. Aaron crossed his arms. And now I'm watching him sit here, acting like he's learning. But my question is, does he actually regret what he did? Silence. Then Lisa spoke. That's a question only Richard Andrews can answer. All eyes turned to him. Richard's throat felt dry. This was it. No pre-written speech. No PR coaching. Just the raw truth. He could deflect. He could perform. Or he could tell them what he had just realized. He leaned forward, gripping his hands together. I regret that I let myself believe I was more important than the people around me, he said, his voice lower than usual. Murmurs. Some skeptical, some intrigued. I regret that I assumed my comfort mattered more than someone else's dignity. Lisa raised an eyebrow. And Richard swallowed hard. I regret that it took me losing everything to finally listen. Silence. Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not in approval. Not in forgiveness. But in acknowledgement. For the first time, she was seeing someone who was actually trying. It wasn't an ending. But maybe, just maybe it was a beginning. The panel discussion had ended. But Richard Andrews remained in his seat long after most attendees had left. The weight of what had just happened still pressed against his chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, he hadn't just been confronted by Lisa Carter, he had been confronted by everyone. by Diane Harper, who had spent 2 decades being questioned simply for existing in her job. By Aaron, the passenger who had watched his humiliation unfold in real time. By the unspoken expectation in the room that this wasn't over just because he said the right words. Lisa Carter hadn't congratulated him. She hadn't extended a hand and said, "You're forgiven." She had only nodded. And somehow, that single gesture meant more than any apology ever could. Long day. Richard looked up to see Ava Martinez, the diversity trainer, leaning against a nearby chair. "You could say that," Richard muttered. Ava studied him. "You handled that better than I expected." Richard scoffed. "I don't even know if I handled it at all." Ava smirked. "Exactly. You didn't try to win the conversation. That's new for you, right?" Richard exhaled. She wasn't wrong. For years, his instinct had been to take control of any situation, to dominate the room with logic, power, or sheer force of will. But this? There was no winning, only understanding. "I don't expect anyone to believe I've changed," he admitted. "Hell, I don't even know if I believe it yet." Ava's smirk faded. "Good," she said simply. "Because if you did, I'd call you a liar." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be encouraging?" "It is," Ava said, "because change isn't about knowing, it's about doing. And that's the part you haven't figured out yet." She grabbed her bag and stood. "But you'll get your chance soon enough." Richard frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ava checked her watch. "You'll see." Then she walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Later that night, as Richard sat in his hotel room, his phone buzzed. New message from Lisa Carter: "Meet me tomorrow morning. My office. 9 a.m. No explanation. No pleasantries. Just another test." Richard stared at the message for a long time before typing his response. "I'll be there." The next morning, Richard found himself once again sitting across from Lisa Carter, her office feeling even more intimidating than the last time. Lisa wasted no time. "I spoke with the airline executives this morning," she said. "They want you to make a public statement about your experience in the diversity program. A final act of accountability before this chapter officially closes." Richard's jaw tightened. Another statement? Another performance? Lisa caught his expression and sighed. "This isn't about making you a hero, Richard," she said. "This is about showing that people in power don't just walk away from moments like this without real consequences. It's about transparency." Richard hesitated. "And what if I say no?" Lisa leaned forward. "Then, that's your choice. But let me be clear, if you back out now, every step you've taken will look like nothing more than a carefully orchestrated PR move." Richard ran a hand down his face. He was tired. Tired of the public scrutiny. Tired of feeling like he was constantly on trial. But wasn't that the point? For years, people like Diane, like Lisa, like every person he had dismissed on that flight, had been dealing with this kind of scrutiny daily. He had 1 month of discomfort. They had a lifetime. Lisa watched him carefully. "This is your moment, Richard. Redemption or reckoning. Which will it be?" Richard looked down at his hands, remembering how easily they had once pointed at a flight attendant, demanding someone be removed. Now, he had to decide if he would do what he had never done before. Own his actions. Publicly. Without excuses. Finally, he met Lisa's gaze. "I'll do it." Lisa nodded. "Then let's get to work." The press conference was scheduled for the following week. Not in a corporate boardroom. Not behind a polished podium. But at the very same airport where this entire incident began. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. As Richard walked toward the press area, he knew this was different from his first apology. The cameras weren't just waiting for a speech. They were waiting for proof. And this time, Richard was ready to give it to them. Richard Andrews stood at the airport terminal where his downfall had begun. The press conference was set up in a small but open area near the same first-class check-in counter where he had made his infamous demand. The symbolism was deliberate. Lisa Carter was standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching. Jonathan Carter was beside her, his expression unreadable. Ava Martinez and Diane Harper were seated in the front row, waiting. And then there were the cameras, the reporters, the entire world, watching once again. Only this time, Richard wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to own it. Richard stepped up to the podium, taking in the sea of faces before him. Some skeptical, some expectant, but none forgiving. Not yet. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "I stand here today, at the very place where I made a choice that revealed something ugly about myself. A choice that showed the world who I really was in that moment." Silence. I assumed my comfort was more important than someone else's dignity. I assumed that my status, my position, my experience gave me the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. And I assumed that because I didn't intend to be harmful, I wasn't. But that was a lie, I told myself. A murmur ran through the crowd. Lisa Carter's expression remained impassive, but she was listening. Over the past few months, I've been forced to do something I had never done before: truly listen. I've listened to the stories of flight attendants who have spent years being questioned about whether they belong in their uniforms. I've listened to passengers who have been humiliated simply for existing in spaces people, like me, have claimed as our own. He exhaled, gripping the podium. And I've learned that an apology isn't enough. A shift in the audience. A few people sat forward. I am not standing here today asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it yet. But I do know this: if I walk away from this moment without taking real action, then every word I've said up to now is meaningless. The room was silent. Richard looked toward Lisa Carter, holding her gaze. That's why, today, I'm not just making another statement. I'm making a commitment. He turned to the audience. I will be working with the Carter Foundation to help fund and expand diversity initiatives in the airline industry. This includes training programs for corporate executives, policy reviews to ensure equal treatment of passengers, and a scholarship fund for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation. A few gasps. Even Lisa's eyebrows lifted slightly. Because real change, Richard finished, doesn't come from just saying the right thing. It comes from doing the work. And this time, I intend to do the work. For a moment, nothing happened. Then scattered applause. Not overwhelming. Not unanimous. But real. Lisa Carter didn't clap. She simply nodded. And that, Richard realized, was worth more than any standing ovation. As the press conference wrapped up, Richard turned to find Lisa waiting for him near the exit. "That was unexpected," she admitted. Richard smirked slightly. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a compliment." Lisa studied him. "So, you're really going to do the work?" "I already started," he said. "The Carter Foundation will be seeing the first donation by next week. And I plan to be involved, not just as a check writer." Lisa nodded slowly. "Good," she said simply. Richard exhaled. "Do you believe me?" Lisa considered that. Finally, she replied, "Ask me again in a year." Richard chuckled. "Fair enough." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing alone, but for the first time, not lost. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about who he would become next. And that journey had only just begun. This story wasn't just about Richard Andrews, it was about the choices we all face. Do we ignore our biases, or do we confront them? Do we make excuses, or do we change? True growth isn't about saying the right words, it's about doing the work. What do you think? Can people truly change? Or is redemption just another performance? Let's talk about it in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this. See you in the next one.